Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm James Woolcock.
So this has been a week of manifestos. The Labour Party, of course, unveiling theirs today. James, the past 7 days, though, perhaps the most memorable of the campaign. We've had stunts and criticism and more TV debates.
I mean, we are only halfway through, and I always hesitate at sort of saying, like, oh my God, it's the most memorable moments of the campaign. But I do think D-Day is going to go down in sort of UK political history as the moment this campaign felt this shift.
And we've had out, of course, the Labour Manifesto this morning. I think the opening lines are perhaps the most interesting. We're digging into the detail in terms of the Labour Party talking about an election about change, a chance to stop the endless Conservative chaos. I think change and chaos in the first opening lines are very important.
I mean, before you even get inside it, just looking at the front cover, this is a grey and red colouring with just Keir Starmer as a large presidential figure. And it's fascinating that the campaign has broadly been about Labour's joint pitch, but Keir himself has been doing the head-to-heads on the back of the debate with Beth Rigby last night, which he won, according to a YouGov poll, pretty decisively. It's interesting to see they're continuing this idea of he being the kind of central figure that pulls it all together.
Yeah, well, it's Thursday, and it means that we have our election panel with us again this week. Joining us is Alice Perry, former chair of Labour's National Executive Committee, Chris Wilkins, former speechwriter to Theresa May, and Luisa Porritt, former Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament. Welcome to all of you. Lovely to see you in person. So, as I say, as we're recording this, we've got the Labour Manifesto that is coming out. In terms of what we read into it, the top lines, James.
I mean, we've all been looking for what was coming on tax, and in there, as promised for many weeks now, in fact many months even, is a pledge not to raise national insurance, income tax and VAT. Now, what is not there, at least not the paragraph that I've got in front of me, is any duration for that. Now, you could be charitable and say that lasts the whole of Parliament, or you could be uncharitable and say it lasts until they decide it doesn't last anymore and circumstances have changed. So I kind of want to go to Alice here. This manifesto, Labour sources tell me, is not supposed to be a surprise. We're not supposed to be stunned by anything here. However, the pitch that Labour have been making is this needs to be a government of national renewal to take over from what they call the worst fiscal inheritance since World War II. Is this pledge and policy platform too safe?
So there was a really interesting poll out in the week about public trust in politics. And so while people might be saying that they'd like to see bold ideas and suggestions, it's also really important in a very challenging economic and geopolitical environment to just be a bit more honest with the public and put forward a platform that is more likely to be something you can actually deliver. People saw numbers splashed on buses during the European Union referendum, and like that, if that doesn't materialise, it damages trust in politics. So while some people might say this kind of feels safe and boring after like 8 or 10 very eventful years in politics, maybe it's time for stability and honesty with the public as well. And to just, as Pat McFadden's been saying, or Keir Starmer, that there'll be lots of things that people would like the Labour government to do. But if the money isn't there for it, there are constraints, and I know Neil Kinnock was saying that Labour shouldn't tie themselves in knots by ruling out so many different tax rises, but the cost of living crisis is one of the biggest issues on the doorstep, and it's probably better to be honest with people about what you can actually do in government.
Yeah, the poll that you were talking about, trusting government basically at a record low, that everybody is very disillusioned across the UK, or large swathes of the voting public are disillusioned, but that sort of affects all politics. So I think that's interesting. I mean, maybe in terms of honesty, we can come back to that, because there are huge, as you say, fiscal challenges. And maybe, if you read some stuff today from the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, talking about actually where the money is being spent in government, there are question marks. But Chris, I want to bring you in, because let's compare and contrast, shall we, the Labour Party manifesto and the hefty tome that we got from the Conservatives. Is there something in there that you think that people are not picking up on? It was terribly detailed, and it was quite a hard manifesto to sort of summarise for voters, don't you think?
I think it was. There's no great retail policy, as we talk about, no great sort of thing that you put up in lights. Obviously, the tax pledges were the key thing that the Conservatives wanted to emphasise, and trying to draw a dividing line between a tax cut in Conservative administration and Labour, who they say want to put taxes up. So that was the thing. I think there's two things I draw out of that. One is that, if you look at public opinion, if you look at polling and focus group work that's done, actually the public tell you that they're quite up for some tax rises if it's going to lead to better public services. Mm-hmm. So drawing a dividing line around tax is interesting in that context, and I think tells you that the Conservatives really, in doing so, are really speaking to a small subset of voters, essentially their base, who they need to mobilise in this election to make sure that this supermajority doesn't sort of emerge and that they have some sort of respectable result. The other thing I'd say about the manifesto, though, is that it's a completely Rishi Sunak manifesto. It's quite detailed, quite technical, which is kind of befitting of the man himself. But what was interesting is what wasn't in there. There wasn't a pledge on a referendum or on pulling out of the ECHR. There wasn't a pledge on inheritance tax, which was the thing that people were expecting. So actually, it was a pretty middle-of-the-road manifesto, essentially, which kind of reflects the man, but therefore it wasn't flashy and therefore not game-changing. And that was what people were sad about.
It's funny on that not flashy point, because More in Common put out a poll, a focus group, where they said the one word that describes how most people in the UK see the campaign at the moment is boring. And it speaks to, in some ways, this has been a boring campaign by those words, because in some ways it feels almost predetermined. Labour saw the tax attack coming, and they made great pains to neutralise it, which speaks to sort of what Alice is saying. And then the Conservatives, though, fought a very successful campaign on making tax the battleground they want to fight the election on. Now, I can remember previous elections where we talked a lot about coalition agreements and how these things are all supposed to be negotiated. Now, Louisa, you're smiling as I look at you. Not to bring up past trauma, but not everything in your 2010 manifesto made it into a government. So, in this manifesto that the Lib Dems put out, which tax does feature, what are the ironclad policies, the things the Lib Dems wouldn't let any potential future partner water down?
Well, I'm not sure we're going to be faced with that dilemma this time round, just being very frank about things. And I think there's actually an upside to that, in that we could be a real pressure group on Labour in the next Parliament, and really holding them to account to be more ambitious, because, as we've been discussing, I think Labour are in quite a difficult position in that they're also having to appeal to quite an awkward coalition of voters. And one of the things I hope the Liberal Democrats will be holding Labour to account on is Europe. Because we've got the Trade and Cooperation Agreement up for review in 2026. And it really feels like Brexit is the elephant in the room in this election. We heard it come up at the debates last night. In fact, there was somebody working for the NHS talking about the impact that that's had on the workforce. And one of the the promises the Lib Dems have put at the heart of our manifesto is to return Britain to the single market, starting with allowing free movement for young people to go and live, work and study across the EU again, up to the age of 35. I think that's going to be really, really important, so that rights and opportunities are restored. But also the single market is so important for our economy. We have a services-based economy here in the UK. So I would like to see that ambition realised. But there's so much more as well. Obviously, the NHS and social care was a key has been a key focus throughout the campaign for Ed. And we've just seen this morning, in fact, that hospital waiting times have gone up for the first time in 7 months. I mean, the NHS is really at crisis point.
But Ed Davey didn't get the grilling. He hasn't done the leaders' debates.
So obviously there was the 7-way debate on Friday, which Daisy Cooper, the deputy leader, did, because everybody else sent their deputy leaders. So he actually hasn't been given the platform and the opportunity yet, but he has been scrutinised. He's had interviews. He had one on one of the major broadcasters already, and if anyone wants to interview him, he will take that opportunity.
And he's done lots of
wherever it may be.
News. Alice, I want to bring you in. Actually, is Reform UK going to be the real opposition to the Labour Party?
Well, it's a really interesting question about trust, and you talked about Europe. one of the things Keir Starmer really wanted to do as leader is restore people's trust in Labour, so they'd actually consider voting for them again after the massive, devastating defeat of 2019. So that was reforming, like, basically trust that you can trust Labour to deal with anti-Semitism, that you could trust them with business, and you could trust them to deliver Brexit. This was a huge moment where, whether you agree with the decision or not, the public came out and they voted to leave the EU. You have to respect that decision. And so this is one of the reasons why Reform UK are that kind of, so some areas where Reform and like Labour, when it comes to like the high streets or Brexit or even the positioning within the Conservatives, it's so fascinating to see how they're positioning themselves. And if Labour hadn't changed in the way that Keir Starmer had said, when Nigel Farage launched his platform, that day Keir had been flanked by like all the veterans who were standing for Labour, and like by radically changing the position on defence and things like that, those areas where Labour lost a lot of votes to UKIP, because Labour did lose millions of votes to the Conservatives and directly to UKIP, winning those voters back is absolutely essential to being able to go from opposition to a majority government. And like, we'll see who the real opposition is. It is for lots of people concerning that they're polling ahead of the Liberal Democrats, and like at one point last week almost neck and neck with the Conservatives. First past the post means they probably won't win too many seats, but Clacton absolutely could be a victory for Nigel Farage.
Mind you, Labour policy, I mean, just to pick you up on the Brexit idea, though, Labour policy is still to have closer relations, much closer relations with the EU. But
outside the single market and customs union with no free movement.
Yes, of course.
She gets the footnote in. I mean, it's fascinating to see how you're all thinking about the policies and how they're positioning your parties, but I cannot let looking back at this week go without the two words, Chris, D-Day. Since then, it does feel like the Conservatives have changed their strategy. We hear talk of Labour supermajorities. Bluntly, has the party given up?
Gosh, I mean, you're right. There has been a change of strategy noticeably this week, and it is talking about don't give Keir Starmer the majority. I had an email from the Conservative Party this morning, as I do most days, and it talks in there about, don't let Keir Starmer have this big majority, don't let Angela Rayner and her union friends, get away with it, all that sort of stuff. It does feel like they've changed. Look, it's interesting what you said at the start, James, about actually the Labour manifesto has Keir Starmer on the front cover, sleeves rolled up, etc. Really interesting, because for a long time it was the Conservatives who wanted to make this a presidential campaign. They were of the view that Rishi Sunak against Keir Starmer was the campaign they wanted. And actually, as the campaign has gone on, I think they're sort of slightly retreating from that, and D-Day was a good example of that. What a disaster. In 20 years in and around politics, I don't think I've seen a more, frankly, disastrous decision, crazy. And I think it was a moment when they just looked at it and thought, actually, this just now isn't working. So now it is all about actually retreating from that slightly and going down this route of saying, look, just don't give them the majority that they can then run, unleash havoc, etc. That's what they're trying to say. It's quite a desperate ploy at this point with three weeks to go, but I think they've tried everything else and nothing else has worked.
Okay, well, on that note, pretty pessimistic. I think we should wrap up this week's discussion. Chris, thank you so much for being with us. Chris Wilkins, former speechwriter to Theresa May. Alice Perry, former chair of Labour's National Executive Committee, and Luisa Porritt, former Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament. Really appreciate you being here in person.
That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo. Our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm James Woolcock. We'll be back with more next week. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.